The heart is an amazing organ. Let's think of it as a muscle that never stops, never gives up. Because of that, it has some very unique attributes and structures, and let's look more closely at the heart. Hi, I'm Dr. Peter Minke. This is Minke Wellness. And, as the cardiovascular system, this is the cardio part, right? This is the heart. The heart's the center of the whole thing. It sits right here in the middle of the chest. And like I said, it's constantly beating. I don't remember exactly when in development, but it's pretty early when that little embryo, that little fetus has a heart that's beating. And of course, that starts in the womb and it never stops. If it does, we're done, right? Well, most muscles, right? You go to your muscle systems. We've done the muscular skeletal system, and these skeletal muscles, and even the smooth muscles, they have resting periods where they're not doing anything. They're not. It's not a constant motion. The skeletal muscles, these are the ones we contract, right? We tell the fingers to contract. They pull down, and then it quits and it lets go. And then it resets and it's ready for another one. In the smooth muscles, let's say that the swallowing muscles of the esophagus, for example, we swallow, it contracts and it pushes the food down, and then it's ready to reset. Well, the heart muscle is, constantly going. The thing is, it's also self-innervating, right? So it's the nervous system. It has its own trigger internally. We call that the pacemaker, right? And it's got its own internal trigger and its own electrical system that does not require our conscious participation. Does not require the brain. Now, the brain can influence the rate of that, but not the actual contracting. And the order in which the different parts are contracting, right? We wouldn't want to accidentally forget to contract the ventricle, after the atrium, right? So the atrial part and the ventricle part, right? The top of the part's called the atrium, and there's two compartments, and they contract and push the blood through valves down into the ventricle, and then the ventricle contracts and pushes blood through valves to the body and to the rest of the body, either to the lungs from the right side or to the rest of the body from the left side. Okay, and so the valves are important because if this thing is contracting, then fluid could pull back, right? So if you have a leaky valve, that's what that means. Then blood is leaking back into it and makes the heart's pumping action less efficient, and everything gets harder, right? We're not delivering blood out to the tissues. We're not delivering nutrients. The body experiences the stress, and then the heart's getting the feedback of, hey, you're not doing your job. You need to step it up. So the heart ends up being enlarged. You hear about the heart being enlarged if there's something happening where the heart's not efficient. So the muscle is told to work. It's working harder and it builds up, right? So that's the thing. If you got an enlarged heart, it means there's something going on that's causing the heart to work harder. And if you work a muscle, it gets bigger. A perfect situation, a perfect heart muscle would remain small and compact and keep, the fluid would flow well. And so when it pumps, it's not receiving any of that back pressure or resistance, and it goes out. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for back pressure, and there's actually a whole video on that. But if the stomach, intestines, if the lymph is thick, that we've talked about this during the hydration, if the blood is thick because you're not hydrated, if the lymph is thick and the system is all silted up, then obviously there's back pressure in the tissues, right? Blood is trying to get through tight areas because of either lymph pressure or even muscular pressure. If you're just tight all the time, stress, then the capillary flow, you can't get blood through there, and so it's going to put back pressure on the heart. The physical, the intestines, the inflammation in the gut can push up, or it puts literal pressure. The colon being inflamed and swollen, the liver all these things, it can push up from below and literally put pressure on the heart, put pressure on the lungs. And that just makes it harder and harder for the heart to do its job. So there are things that can influence the heart from the standpoint of structure. There's another thing to think about with the heart, and that is the heart is encased in what's called the pericardium. It's wrapped in a very, very unique saran wrap kind of thing with fluid inside of there. And this is to keep everything lubricated, right? Because this is a constant motion. If if you have a click, in a joint where you can go click 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 click, right? That click is a tendon, or maybe even a ligament, but usually a tendon snapping over a bone. Well, eventually that's not a good thing. Eventually that's going to wear out, right? You don't want anything rubbing against something, right? And so here's where the heart is protected with a very slick lubrication in the pericardial sac, and so that as it's doing its contraction over and over and over again, it's not building up friction or minimizing the amount of friction, so that you don't get wearing. It's not wearing out. Well, the rib cage, the shape, because this sits in the middle of the rib cage, in the middle of the lungs. If the rib cage is torqued or contracted, literally, you can squeeze pressure on the heart and affect the heart's beating. Now, if you have scoliosis or a rib that's out of place, that pops out of place in the rib head right next to the heart, it can put pressure on the heart and radiate around, and the heart it's beating and hitting the rib, or hitting the rib cage. This happens in scoliosis, where there's a lot of curvature. And so you'll find that a lot of people with scoliosis have an arrhythmia. What happens is the heart will beat and hit up against, and a lot of times it's the atrium, it'll hit up against the rib cage. Well, when you strike the heart, like if you take the heart out and you flick it, you poke it, that physical insult to the heart causes it to beat again. So you have a situation where the actual structure is wrapped around the heart, and it hits up against the rib cage, and it causes it to beat again. So you get a beep, 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 beep. And if it's atrial, it's called fibrillation, atrial fib, an AFib. And there are other reasons for AFib, but the one of them is structure. You can have an arrhythmia from the structure. And if you actually get the body released and you open up the rib cage, you can actually find that an AFib disappears. And I know if you talk to a cardiologist, they'd say, no, it's impossible, it can't be done. That's not true. We've done it. I mean, okay, I've experienced it directly. The more the body got opened up, the more the rib cage opened up, the less and less and less the AFib was there, until the point where now it's just pretty much steady. So this is I don't know what to tell you. This is the best explanation I have for that phenomena. Okay, so we're talking about this situation where there's a lot of factors that are coming in on the heart, and this makes it, if you have pressure on the heart in any of these different ways, you can experience panic and stress, because when the heart's not pumping right. Or the same thing happens with the breathing. If you go back to my month 1, and we talked about when you restrict the breathing, when you affect the heart, those things are affected, there's going to be a feedback loop, because it's so important. If the heart stops, if the heart's compromised, then the body dies. The brain has a place in it that is monitoring at all times the status of your breathing and of your heart rate. And when it doesn't, if it's reading an alert, if a red light goes off there, it sends the whole system into panic. Which means that if you have so much tension in your rib cage that you're putting pressure in your heart, or if your digestion is so inflamed that you're putting pressure in your heart, then you can have increased baseline stress. Your whole stress level goes up because your body is reading this pressure on the heart. Same thing with the diaphragm. And it's actually, those go hand in hand. Pressure on the diaphragm, can't breathe. You're going to register a higher levels of panic and stress. So one of these things that we're talking about is just literally physically get your body opened up, get the tension out of your body so that your panic level can reduce, and then you can deal with your emotional elements that are truly emotional based. This level of panic and stress is not even emotional based. It's purely a physical reflex, the body talking back saying, hey, I've got this stress. Okay, so the valves, let's talk just a moment about the valves, and they are vulnerable. They're very tender and sensitive tissues. Now they're tough. I'm not saying I say tender. they're vulnerable, and especially in the context, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in another video, with the mouth, right? And so you know that when you go to the dentist, they have you take an antibiotic, and you go, well, what's that about? Well, the basic premise there is if you introduce a whole lot of bacteria suddenly into the bloodstream, that bacteria can potentially, not in a very common way, but potentially can lodge into the heart and get stuck in the valves and create an inflammation of the valves. And then damage the valves, and then you end up with long-term problems. Now, of course, I mean, I don't know if you want to rely on technology, but they can do valve replacements, which is absolutely amazing. That they can do these amazing surgeries that put the heart back together. Like, wow, oh my gosh, this is just amazing how we've developed technology that can help people. And this is one of those situations. Obviously, would love to keep the heart healthy and not have to do a plastic valve or whatever. I mean, this is better not to do that. So anyway, that has to do with the mouth and bacteria. So you can get, or if you go back to, those, in the olden days, rheumatic fever, things where we didn't have any treatments for these, or very ineffective treatments, you end up with fever that was high enough, and infection that would damage the heart. There's other things that damage the heart. I went through chemotherapy that damages the heart. Literally, the chemical that was pumped into my bloodstream is damaging, and it is caustic, and it rips up the veins and the arteries in the heart, and so potentially there's damage to the heart that way. So there's a lot of different things that can do that. So let's talk about how to repair the heart. We know what the heart needs. Like physically as a muscle, it needs good circulation. It needs oxygen. The actual muscle itself needs oxygen. That's what happens with a heart attack, is the veins, the arteries that feed blood to the muscle of the heart itself get blocked and clogged, and cut off circulation, and so the heart muscle dies. It's not getting enough oxygen. It goes into spasm. It can't do its job, and it spasms, just like a cramp, like a leg cramp at night. Well, your heart cramps. That's a heart attack. And when the heart cramps, obviously it's not pumping blood, and the whole system is in distress. So we need to make sure the heart muscle itself gets those nutrients. It has to have oxygen, and it has to have nutrients, water. So let's breathe oxygen and soak the heart muscle itself. So I'm going to breathe in, and I'm going to send that oxygen-rich blood to the heart muscle. Now, I'm not talking about the heart where it's pumping out to the body. I'm not talking about the blood. We've already done that in month 2, breathing into the blood and having the blood pump out. I'm talking about breathing into the heart itself and feeding the heart that oxygen and minerals and rich, nutrient-rich blood. Okay, and I'm actually experiencing that my heart muscle has some stress. Like I said, probably got a lot of heart damage from the chemotherapy. So I'm going to be working on this a little bit more this month, doing a little bit more daily breathing, paying attention to the heart muscle. And then the veins, you can do the whole cardiovascular system with the breathing, do the scrubby bubbles, do the healing work with your mind through the therapeutic breath system. So I'm going to breathe into the heart. I can actually think of the heart. Okay, tell me if it's a rose bush, remember the imagery. I can actually just look at it as a rose itself and say, okay, show me how you're doing. Breathe in. Let me see the imagery of the heart as it is. Okay, and then I'm going to really breathe it in and have that nice, beautiful, rich flower just bloom and be vibrant with all those nutrients. And actually, my heart is actually quite tired. So no, we don't. That's not a good thing. Not a good thing for your heart muscle to be tired. So I'm going to have to work on this, right? Okay, so breathing in and saturating the heart with good nutrients, minerals, amino acids, all the nutrients it needs to be healthy. It's starting after about what it's taken me this many breaths. This is unusual for me. So I'm going to be working on this. And just feeling that heart itself, the heart muscle. So we want to be nice to our body. We want to really focus. And this is why we're going through this kind of thing and using breath to connect, because we don't want to miss anything, right? We don't want to be, oops, I didn't know about that part of my body. I wasn't aware of that part of my body. So we need to, do this breathing and get aware of each part of our body and work with it. And that's why we're doing this over a whole year. You can't do that sitting down in one sitting. Okay. So, happy breathing, breathe into your heart, send the heart all the goodness, and be healthy one day at a time. So I'm going to be working on this. You work on your own heart one day at a time. Happy wellness.